Hello.
Hey, Bradley.
Hi.
How's it going?
All right.
How are you all?
Okay.
I'm okay. My screen fatigue today was worse than usual,
Oh,
but that's because I've been more productive than usual with work. So pros and cons.
I guess we can begin here. Put this here. One last thing. Open this up. My updates for this kind of period are I'm pulling up the materials for today. Is this legible at all for the
Yeah.
stuff here?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, it's not really cool. So my update for today, I guess, is it's been a tough. Hey Morgan, it's been a tough it's been a really tough last 2 days, and it's really been frustrating because I was on the verge of making a lot of progress on the paper, the ISPSM paper, and also the manifesto stuff and project. Like that's been very much on my mind. It's just I got another essentially emergency has came up that I've had to just tend to, and it's extremely frustrating. And even like kind of getting ready tonight, I didn't know I would have time to do anything for this meeting until like an hour ago. Just extremely frustrating. But just as a general update, I don't know if Amanda's going to want to talk about any ISPSM paper stuff today. I'm kind of imagining not, which is just fine. I would really like to aim to talk more about it this weekend at the main meeting, at least for myself, because I want to get some iterative feedback, and it's approaching rapidly and painfully fast. As far as other stuff, and I'll say more later. We're going to catch you up, but just for the meantime, I'm just gonna talk about it directly. As far as other stuff, we maybe haven't really talked about it that much last time or recently, but all the different things we've been talking about from the cybernetics project onwards, reimagining cybernetics, the math stuff, philosophy, history, and science. All the different components, like those are in play for me. I did some things in the Big Ideas Discord now. I'm gonna try to rearrange that. It's always this tension between like project-based updates or just finding things that kind of contextually make sense and contribute to it. So it's tough that way. Things are there, and I really want to just. Hopefully tomorrow is a calmer day because I've lost 2 days this week, as far as I'm concerned, and it's really unpleasant to lose those 2 days on stuff I wanted to do. But I would like some eventual feedback about the new grouping. I think I've kind of said it before, but like I'm gonna kind of make the other project essentially sort of Cognition features in nature, but not like replacing it. Just sort of a space to hold a lot of things underneath which I can sort of solicit some like micro projects or get help with feedback. That's the like the infrastructure for it because it just has to emerge that way. But I don't know. It feels like much ado about nothing in some ways. Because I'm just saying, oh yeah, I want to do this, and then I can't do that. But that's sort of where it's at. So, yeah. Outside of that, I don't know if any other updates or any. Hey, Morgan, glad to see you here. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah,
how you get in your mind.
Yeah, I think it's somewhat relevant, or it was interesting today. We're reading a Romain Brette paper, right? And so I met this morning with the Cog Lab, and which is also they also run the NeurotechX Paris group, but it very much started as Cog Lab. Cog Lab existed before NeurotechX, and so this is basically a cognitive science student-run cognitive science group in Paris, well, in France, and they were. So one, it was just funny because one of the PhD students that joined is doing like very similar work to the kind of research work that Amanda's doing at the Center for Consciousness Studies. And it's all about sleep and levels of consciousness,
Cool.
and electrophys of that, which was funny. But and then another like guy who was a postdoc, and I think he's been in industry coming back to do whole brain emulation, and basically the kind of computational neuroscience that this guy Brett is the lead developer of Brine 2, which is like someone who's very interested in like spiking neural networks and neuromorphic computing and things like that. And anyway, they when I said that you were covering this paper, they weren't familiar with it, and they were pretty interested. So I think they might be covering it themselves.
Yeah.
And two, just they found that all these connections they thought were very interesting, and again, like. I'll keep posting it, at least for anybody who wants to try and make it. You can come, because it's like it's their evening, but it's our morning, or it's West Coast morning, or East Coast lunchtime. For anybody who's interested, it was a great discussion over a couple hours today, and but it was the first one we'd had in many months.
Good. Amanda?
Yeah, so I'm working on the ISPSM presentation. I still feel good about it despite not having like a proper draft. But I have an outline that has the order, the organization down, and then I have a bunch of notes that I feel like I have all the pieces of the puzzle. And that's what that Google Doc is basically. So it's a work in progress, but still in a state ready for any kind of commenting, if you have time.
Okay.
And then on Saturday, I'll have a proper presentation. I'll aim for like 10 minutes. The one for the actual conference is going to be 20, I believe. It's 30 minutes, and that includes the Q&A. So it's probably around 20, and then however long you take, that just cuts into your Q&A. But yeah, I'll have more to say on Saturday.
All right, that sounds great. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, and at some point we should look at like the next wave of things to like try to apply to and get papers to kind of in the space of this project. We weren't really talking this much about it, but I don't think the main group really knows about ISPM that much. So yeah. Okay. For project development topics in general, I mean, and I kind of already covered that. There's not really a lot of new items to say other than just stuff going on behind the scenes slowly. Yeah. But yeah, just do this. Cool. I don't know if that's a good ratio. Let's see. Uh, yeah, there we go. Okay, I think this is the. I'm doing a little different setup, and I can't quite tell. Is the it doesn't quite look like it's being kind of just over more? No, not really. Is this a decent ratio of like the sizes of each thing, or should I try to make them? Like, is that legible? That's
Yeah.
okay. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So, we don't really have anything here. We got kind of. Whoa, that's not at all what I wanted to do. Okay. Let me look. Which is the only one not listed here. Thank you. Thank you, Auto Select. Oops. I think we took notes here because I think we took some notes on this, but yeah. Okay, I'll have to clean this up later, but we can start our digging notes here, I guess. We were at somewhere around. Oh no, that's still Lamoros paper. Yeah. Okay. Oops. Is that technically from this? Is this from this current paper, or is this from a different paper?
That looks like this paper.
Yeah, that's this one.
Technically.
Yeah, there it is up
This
there.
is
Yeah.
from- Okay, cool. I don't think we got all the way that far down, did we? Maybe we did.
Well, we skipped to the conclusion.
Oh yeah, we skipped to the. That's right, and then and there's a whole bunch of other responses to this. That's right. Okay, so I guess maybe we can refresh our conclusion somewhat, um, and go from there. Um, I'll do this actually. So, this is gonna be a little.
Sorry, Jesse. Do I need to give you my Gmail to access the Notion? Fine. Forgive me for asking for the first time. Oh, okay. You did you get a message from me? Yeah. I was just trying to link through from the Slack link, and it asked me to log in. Oh, you know what? Now I'm in. I think I just needed to refresh my browser or something. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I might have. I don't know. Sometimes it's a little tricky, but yeah. So if we were to like take notes on this page somewhere, or whatever. I guess we could just start from the top. I don't know. Did we want to like say any thoughts from the conclusion last time? I feel like we had this paper on, or this comment last time that we took away, which was this technically thing in Fuchs and Homunculus, but I don't know. And you can just go through it from the start. I'm not sure why this is good. Oh, sorry. This is all. There we go. Okay. I guess we'll just start from the top. Let's see. Yeah, today. So this is going to be there. I guess that's okay. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone's read more of the paper and wants to talk with like general thoughts and feelings about the paper from last time, but it's quite an interesting paper because there's this thing and there's a whole bunch of. I did not read all the different responses that are coming up to it, but it's kind of a critique, if I remember correctly, of kind of saying the the, the, the only one aspect of coding and decoding kind of makes sense, and kind of questioning the coding metaphor in general and so on. So, um, any opening thoughts and feelings? Sure.
Dive right in, I guess.
Here we go. Um,
I mean, just one brief thing, and again, I'm sorry I've so superficially read this, but it seems like someone who really wants to have a developmental understanding of who really wants you know like I don't see developmental neuroscience represented as much as I would like here.
Right.
Mm.
yeah, it seems to be very from a certain.
A lot of like the alignment issues and other kind of contextual issues like I keep wondering like has he also studied developmental or something?
Right. In the sense that he doesn't talk about them, or that like
That he doesn't talk
yeah,
like why isn't that like yeah I mean a lot of these coding issues are done by people who are working on adult systems
right.
and not thinking about how these systems would develop organically. If um, I'm not saying that well, but
I think that's a pretty fair, like maybe under underserved critique of the coding computer metaphor thing in general. I mean, it's there, but it's kind of implicit a little bit compared to like, yes, you're kind of assuming a very specific stage of development, and biological systems are not always operating in that way, and are operating different fluctuations and so on and so forth. And even like the Norbert Wiener quote that I sometimes mentioned about like the difference between the machine and the brain is that one run of the brain will like one run of a machine, whereas the machine gets to be able to turn off and on all the time. And it's sort of like it kind of fits with the distorted nature that maybe the paper's trying to talk about. But you know, I think that's a valid point to bring up about development.
Yeah. Well, they mention Lakoff and Johnson, so they're saying that the primary framework, contextual framework of cognition, I guess, or neural activity is language in some ways. So and then but that's kind of a developmental view. That could be kind of given a little bit broader context. There's also the aspect of developmental, like how neurons develop and how they start to wire together, and that doesn't really talk about that. Like I said, I'm interested in giving a short presentation on this at some point. But I'm actually also interested in what Morgan said about maybe like a developmental view on neural coding, as more of like a paper idea or something like that. I don't know. I didn't read through all of the responses either. I wonder if there's like a developmental response to it.
That's why I was hesitating. I was like, I'm sure like somebody must have
Yeah.
some developmental person must have, but like your language point, like like a lot of linguists arguing about language, like gets supplanted by people studying kids learning language
Right.
and seeing like, oh, but you can't explain this kind of vocabulary acquisition in this kind of time period. Like there's obviously other mechanisms going on, right?
Right.
Or like just so much as you get from looking at how these systems actually develop organically,
Yeah.
as opposed to looking at them in their fully functioned form. And I mean, I'm thinking a little bit about the brain is paper, and there's just so many ways you can look at it, but also the just the metabolism, like all that neural activities are going on in a lot of different organic contexts that don't exist in machines or information theory.
Yeah.
This resets every time I search. That's terrible. Oh well, I tried using I might change it next time, but I tried using like PDF reader itself, and I'm not sure I want to do that in the future. But I see you've started writing something here, Amanda. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so just going off of the development point, one of the ideas that came up throughout the paper is that there's like the encoding of information depends so much on context that you can't say that all of the information like makes it into the neural codes. There's too much context dependence. And maybe one way to think about the development issue is how much of the context in this relevant sense of context comes from like the history of the organism and the way it's developed. So the author, it seems to be focusing for the most part on like at a certain moment in time, like this is what the information is in the environment, this is what the brain is capable of like taking as an input, and there's not enough information that like makes it into the brain that you can say that the world is being encoded and then decoded. But then when you bring in like a temporal context, I wonder like what that adds, or if that's even a good way to talk about it. To talk about development as adding context in the sense that the author is trying to talk about. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, one view of development is as itself sort of a decoding of, like, there's a developmental program that a lot of organisms follow. It's for a general pattern of like, expressing things at a certain time in development. And there's a lot of context there, but there's a lot that sort of an innate mechanism. So, for example, there's a certain period of development where there's a lot of synaptogenesis. There's a period of development where there's a spurt in growth, or, where things become mature. We have critical period windows. All those things can be decoded from, say, like the genome, or, they play a role in sort of how information is decoded or decoded. So that coding first of all, that coding mechanism is inherent in development too, and you could argue about that, but yeah, I mean, this idea of coding and decoding, you're basically taking things from the environment and you're coding them into something, and then or retrieving them or decoding them. So it's like there's a substrate there that's doing this, and that substrate, of course, could be just the brain that's quote unquote static, or it could be a brain that's developing and is going through growth and other stages. So something gets coded in a brain at one point in development, and then the brain transforms, and then that information somehow transforms, or there's some plasticity, and that may transform what's being stored, and then there's a decoding, which is just basically retrieving things from that encoding. But if that encoding's changed in any way, of course, then it's going to look different coming out. Or it could be generative, meaning that like if you encode something once, you can decode it in different ways and get different sort of combinations of things out. So it's not like just a single, linear mapping. It would be like, how ants build ant hills, or termites build termite mounds. they have a general idea of, how it needs to be done, but through their interactions, they build the thing and it looks different. There's a self similarity, but it looks different in every case. And so maybe that's what we're dealing with, is this sort of, generative retrieval where it's decoded, but it's generative, it's encoded, maybe even in a generative manner. And the substrate isn't static, it's changing. So it's something that, on the one hand, you can't say that, neural codes, it kind of erases the allure of neural code as some sort of, predictable thing. On the other hand, it does give us this general mechanism to work from.
Yeah, and again, like trying to capture, like why do critical periods exist?
Right.
Right. Like critical periods shouldn't exist in a machine.
Right.
But critical periods certainly exist in a biological machine, if you will.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the massive number of kind of models that kids are bringing to like all sorts of situations and switching them out, and the role of play in learning. Again, in I'm thinking of like not only machine learning and how they try and use I forget what they use a particular verb for it's like seeking out food. Sorry, the machine learning people use a particular term for it, and but also just like Kenneth Stanley's kind of stuff in terms of the role of play and the role of curiosity and things like that.
Yeah. And it's this generative aspect, right? Like you don't want to just go with one thing, and like you don't just get exposed to one thing. You get exposed to a bunch of things or in a bunch of different ways.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like you're, I mean, like potentially you're kind of exploring what each model gives you, and assuming that there is something happening under the hood, again in this kind of very linear fashion, but
Right.
I think it's potentially much more quantum in the sense that it's all happening at the same time.
Right.
Somehow,
Yeah, and there are two things I would say that there was a really interesting paper, and I don't know if I lost it or put it someplace. It reminded me of Plot Twisters is big on play, and play as like a combinatorial exploration. It's quite interesting because there's a lot of overlap in the discussion, even though Plot Twisters is not looking at this from this context at all, but like very much so. And I thought I put the paper in the Plot Twisters group, but I cannot find it right now, which is quite frustrating to me. So I'll have to come back to that. But also, like, yeah, I think that sort of what we were just saying definitely is a factor of just like sort of the static. I think is this the paper that gets into like the perfect observer stuff too, or is that the previous paper was?
No, this one gets into that.
Yeah, the as ideal observer, yeah, the ideal observer stuff, and just like the ideal observer, and also sort of like the implied ideal static mechanistic substrate versus like the and I'm sorry, what's that? Oh, I lost someone to something. Versus like the messiness and just the inherent chaos of the constant, immersion with reality, and the homeostatic like pressure internally too. And it's something that I said last time, just like the difference between how hard it is. Oh yeah, kind of following up from even last Thursday, uh, like one of the things from that meeting was um, like having to keep everything moving together that I talked about. I don't really talk about articulate right now, but basically how like even memory is kind of, I think I'm developing some ideas about like memory is not just a chunk, but like a a process that's offloaded and unloaded and have all these things kind of self-referencing, or like it doesn't exist unless it's in three places kind of idea, but in an embodied sense of like you have this kind of reinforcement to say, oh yeah, that's a thing. And even in playing like you know I digress, but okay, interesting line of development with the developmental aspect. um yeah, so let's continue. uh I think we're familiar with the abstract, so I don't need to go over that again, but there was these he has these 3 points of critique. uh the coding metaphor tries to fit a dynamic circular distributed causal structure of the brain into a linear chain of transformations observables, but the two causal structures are incongruent. And he concludes, uh, there's some things to consider. Neural coding, Lakoff and Johnson, yes. Visual signal stuff. Sort of nice diagrams. Let's see. If anyone sees anything on these pages they want to talk about, let me know. But yeah, I think we talked about this last time, but I'll bring it again here. This is kind of a summary paragraph. These three elements, correspondence, representation, and causality, constitute the conceptual scaffold of neural coding metaphor. It could be argued the most technical work on neural coding uses only the first technical sense of correspondence, where the word code is a synonym for correlate. The use of metaphor would thus amount to only an inappropriate but innocuous choice of words. What about the scope if they have no causal power? Critique of Skinner by Chomsky summarizes the problem with proper metaphors, saying Skinner utilizes the experimental results as evidence for scientific character of the system of behavior, and analogic guesses formulated in terms of the metaphoric extension of the technical vocabulary of the laboratory is evidence for its scope. The goal of this article is to demonstrate this quote fully applies to neural coding metaphor, where the scope is a particular theory of the brain function implied by the conceptual structure of the metaphor. I think we mentioned that a few times before, but just as a reference point. I think we're kind of familiar with this stuff. We examine the representational power of neural codes. Neural codes are research. The fundamental reason is that the coding metaphor conveys an inappropriate concept of information representation. Neural coding metaphor tries to fit the causal structure of the brain dynamic circular distributed into the causal structure of neural codes, atemporal, linear. It's kind of related to what you said. Then this is our congruent. Okay.
So let me go back up a little bit. Going back up a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. So in the paragraph you were highlighting there, so basically when we examine the representational power of neural codes, and they show the examples of that, we realize that the coding variables are shown to correlate with stimulus properties, but the code itself depends on experimental context. So this means that we want to have the stimulus properties. We want to have, we want to extract a code out of something. So like if we had a bunch of objects like a ball and a vase and like a book, those things would have their own code. Those things you would be able to look at those and you'd be able to present them at random to subjects and you'd be able to get a neural code of those things. So, I mean, people actually do this. This is one of the sort of the assumptions of brain-computer interfaces. But also people have tried to do this at fMRI where they've tried to extract codes out of, object representations out of the brain. So, if you're looking at something that has a pattern in it, or even if you're watching a movie, can you extract those things out of certain parts of the brain? So that's what the assumption is. And so, you should be able then, ideally, to take any one object that someone's looking at, take that thing out, and there's a code for it. And so what they're arguing, though, is that that may be true, but then there's another part of this, which is where the code actually depends on experimental context. So the stimulus, properties, protocol, etc. Therefore, neural codes do not provide context-free symbols. So you need context in those things. So you can have the objects like a vase or a ball, beach ball, or a tire, but sometimes the brain needs context to know that that's actually a beach ball or a tire, and it could just be that shape. And it doesn't necessarily say whether or not that thing is a beach ball or a tire. It's just that shape being represented. And then, it's up to the subject to kind of make sense of what that is. So, if you had people from two different cultures, one person might think that's a tire, another might have another name for it, or they might not have a tire in their culture. It might be like something else, and like a torus. They they live in an abstract world and they just have tori. They don't have wheels and tires. So those would be two different things, two different names, two different contexts. So the code might look quite different for that. And so that's what they're getting at. It's kind of interesting because it's important to think about that if you're thinking about these application domains, but also because you want to say something about the object. I mean, does it matter if you have context, or does it matter that you just represent that thing in your brain and then you can interpret it any way you want? I mean, that's because if you're a fan of neural codes, you might not be interested in the context so much. You might be more interested in just being able to recognize certain things. And so, I mean, it's really, I guess I get the point, but it's like maybe it's in the eye of the beholder too.
But it's hard also not to look at some of these references, right, and recognize that when they were doing these studies, and yeah, these were some of the first animal studies, to figure out some basic properties of kind of neuronal assemblies, right?
Right.
And but like we also know that a big change in like the last 5 years has been doing the same studies with animals freely moving, non-anesthetized.
Yeah.
Like in much more realistic environments. Sorry, somebody's calling. And like the activity that we get is completely different.
Right.
Or the if you want to call it the coding or the neural representations are not similar in any way.
Right. Yeah, because it's naturalistic.
Yeah, and like people are like, hey, wait, we've got to redo all these studies. I mean, there's like a real understanding of the kind of contextual importance and that I see in current studies.
Right. Yeah, I get your point. Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to say it's like a people refer to it as like a straw man argument or something, but it's still a very
Selective
it's
interpretation.
somewhat older. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think a lot of that is, like I want to make the distinction between like just the canonical neurocoding literature and like what we have to think about if we want to like apply this to naturalistic context, because ultimately we do a lot of experiments in highly controlled settings, and it's not really naturalistic, but that's the world we live in, which is naturalistic. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like we couldn't be doing what we're doing now if we didn't have, like decades of psychophysics work.
Right.
where you're, just figuring out like just noticeable differences in neurons, or like figuring out orientation representation and things like that. But obviously, these are, like yeah, those representations are incredibly simplistic by design. By design.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's that's a really great example of like a microcosm of like a lot of, like, I think that's emblematic or representative of a lot of like challenges across a lot of domains. It's like the necessity of having have that really bad, really not bad, but like reduced and simplistic um building blocks to realize, kind of get your bearings, but also just say like they can't do that. So it's like, how do you, like, this is like I'm going bridging off to like
I'm thinking of the Uden paper,
which one? The other one.
yeah, I want to remember the other person on the paper too.
Bolton?
Bolton, yeah. That like there are so many different ways of looking at the brain, and the kind of the psychophysics work that and then the kind of the physiological psychophysics work that gave us orientation representation and these other kinds of things, like, were absolutely needed as first steps, right? But they were obviously limited because we were just getting started, and there's so many other things to take into it. So many other metaphors work.
Yeah, and I feel like that's I would love to develop a way that's a little more, I don't know, conveying to people coming into the field, like where in the maturity of the things are they, because it's it's such a, like, that context is important. Yeah, okay. Anything else from this section you wanted to come on, Bradley, or others?
No, I didn't know if Amanda had something to say or not.
Well, I've been trying to think of a better way to say what I was trying to get at before with like temporal context. But looking back, it seems like the idea of neural coding that he's arguing against is, he defines it as being atemporal. So whatever I have in mind is like a possible solution. I don't think that would really be the target of his arguments. I guess I'm thinking like if you somehow had the entire developmental history of the brain, would the spikes actually encode more information than if you're just looking at a particular time slice? But I'm not sure what that would. I think that when I say like encode more information with that temporal context, that's just like not the kind of encoding he's even getting at. So no, I don't have a more clear way to say what I was getting at before. Okay. I guess a separate thought though, I like the psychophysics example because those, like that seems like good science and good results. precisely maybe because it's like looking at phenomenon that are not dynamic in the ways that that the author is saying, like most of our movement through the world is. So when you, like, in that particular context, when you're looking at very, very simple things, you get it right, you discover something. But so in a sense, like, that is foundational. But it seems like trying to use that as a foundation to look at cases that are more like variable and contextual and naturalistic, it just doesn't really work anymore. um, Maybe because yeah, like, because in the psychophysics case you're able to, like, the context kind of doesn't matter so much, like you're looking at like the atom level, like the more reduced level. um so maybe it's not right to say, like, that's should be the foundation for the rest of these more naturalistic studies, because it seems like it's just too reduced. It would be like trying to use um I don't know, chemistry or physics for sociology. Maybe that's an appropriate metaphor.
Yeah, yeah. It's yeah. It's interesting you said that. It's just reminding me a lot of Carl Pribram's book. I think it's like Languages of the Brain. So here's, this is someone who like was very familiar with these kind of 1950s studies. And as well as working at Yerkes Primate, head of the Yerkes Primate Center, like doing these, again, like psychophysics with recordings in particular areas, but how difficult he found it to expand beyond that, like this metaphor didn't work, to some degree. I'm just remembering that as being a part of that particular text. I can try and dig that up too and see if if he has some better examples of what what led him to try and find other metaphors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm. Oops, here we go. Let's go through 2.1. Coding stimulus properties, including an experimental primer. We talked about this. Any comments on the cartoon example from color perception with Crick and this stuff? Let's see.
That was interesting to think about, in terms of like analog representation, like that figure 2A. It shows how the physiological variable, the current, varies. I don't know, isomorphically. It like shares a structure with the variation in wavelength. So if you're just looking at that, I was like, that maybe is like an example of an analog representation in the brain. But that's like not that's like too small of a unit, because I guess in 2D it's demonstrating how what color is, and like it's a conglomeration of all the neurons that are behaving this way. So for like one layer of neurons, or maybe more, I guess, you get something that could be representation-y, but I thought this section was interesting in that it showed how quickly that falls apart.
Yeah, of course.
Oh,
go ahead.
Well, sorry, just thinking of Carl again, I know that he would say, you really need to see Devoy and Devoy if you want to capture, like that would be a couple decades later.
Yeah.
I'll find.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've been able to do things in premotor cortex in terms of decoding some of these kind of very simple encodings. So in premotor cortex, you have a bunch of neurons and they all have their own representation of the angle at which you'd like to move. And so, movement is generated by sort of all these possible answers, and then the signal from all those neurons are somehow averaged out, and you end up with an average direction of movement, and then that ends up being sort of the thing that gets passed on to motor cortex to be executed as a movement. So, we've kind of figured that out, and of course we use that in brain-machine interfaces. We can have a recording from that part of the brain. We can process the information and actually extract some meaningful thing that does something. Now, for other things, of course, that's for something like movement direction. But for other things, maybe that doesn't work as well. And so I think wavelength is an interesting example. You do have like these, you have to think in terms of population and not just single neurons. You have to think like, okay, what is the population doing? And then how much of the population is, what is the consensus amongst the population? Because there are other papers that have been written on sort of the strategies that are taken. Maybe strategies is too strong a word, but like the ways in which these things are sort of averaged over in biology. So there are things like different consensuses that the neurons come together, come to an understanding. I'm putting a lot of anthropomorphic language on here, but basically the idea is that you have this collective of cells. They have very, very similar signals, but they're not aligned. And then there's some overarching principle that aligns them, whether it's some sort of consensus coding or maybe consensus like a quorum sort of thing or whatever. That's how we end up with the thing that gets turned into behavior or maybe gets sent to the next step in the brain. So, yeah.
Okay, nice. And yes, thank you for adding notes and covers that. Wait, it's so good. I'm getting used to the setup. Sometimes I'm clicking on the wrong shit. I'm like, geez, why is the PDF? The otherwise neuron, overwise neurons, excuse me, and its ideal observer.
It knows too much.
What's that? Sorry.
It knows too much. Must be silenced. Yes.
A little bit too much there. Do we want to talk about figure 3 at all? It's kind of stuck here before I'm running stuff.
Yeah, that could be useful.
Okay,
yeah, this is directional sound. This is a classic system of sound localization. So you have this sound wave hits both ears and maybe coming from the left. It hits the left ear first and then the right ear. And there's this temporal difference. It's very tiny, but the nervous system can detect it by comparing the firing rate on two sides of the auditory cortex. And that's averaged. Of course, it's a population average. So, some neurons are going to, because there's noise in the signal, it's not perfect. There's a lot of reverberation, but it gets averaged out over those neurons. And then you get this profile in C where you get the firing rate, which is different between the two hemispheres or from the two sources from the two ears. And yeah, the medial superior olive, which is where this is being integrated, is doing this coding. So you have a firing rate that differs, and so you can find the difference, and from there, I guess distance can be inferred. That's a nice. Now, what does he say about it? He says that's an ideal case, I guess, is his argument that.
Let's see. Arrival times. I guess it's saying. Okay. I mean, I don't know if this is what you want to find, but talk about in conclusion about localization. What about discrimination?
Basically, there's no way that the environment can have enough, or there's too much context in the environment for all of it to be encoded.
Let us spell it out. The ideal observer reads the activity of the neuron. When the first stimulus is presented, it stores the number of spikes produced by the neuron into a window given duration chosen by the experimenter after the stimulus. It ignores all spikes produced before and after that window until the second stimulus presented, upon which it stores again the number of spikes produced by the neuron. Then it retrieves the two stored numbers, compares them, and decides to push one of the two buttons. It's not so obvious how this ideal observer can be mapped to the pathway above, but for example, the number of spikes of an arbitrary neuron in the brainstem produced during several predefined time windows can be stored working with the comparison for later comparison. Ideal in the sense of makes the best of all information, available information. Why then is not such justification ever provided when ideal observers are introduced? The reason, it seems, is semantic drift from the technical sense of code to a representational sense of code, which is logically flawed. The same flaw appears underlying leading theories of neural population coding.
Wait a minute, let's go back to that. So what he's arguing, I guess, is that let's see. It would seem that empirical evidence or argumentation should be required to support such questionable hypotheses. That is, implying that the brain reads the neural code and then making claims about perception and behavior while totally ignoring the mechanisms by which the behavior is produced, as well as the constraints that the organism must face in ecological situations, like having full information about the environment, which if it's sufficiently complex you can't know because it's just too much to have, or that sort of thing. So these claims rely on implicit linking propositions based on abstract constructs. So neural activity, it reduces it to a processor register like a computer where the brain manages to store, retrieve, and manipulate whatever it is in the brain and whenever it occurs. So it's like basically a perfect register where you can record everything, and maybe the brain doesn't work like that because, first of all, maybe there's too much information in the environment, as Amanda said, where there's too much noise that you can't know. There's ambiguity, which happens a lot in sound. So that's a kind of thing that he's kind of up in arms about. And then, so what is the thing? Why is it that no such justification is ever provided when ideal observers are introduced? So why do we go with the ideal observer model? Maybe we shouldn't go in the ideal case. Maybe we should go with like the least sort of the least assumption case and build from there, I guess is the argument. Which that makes sense because you can, it's like kind of going with the best case scenario, and then saying, well, that's the way things always work, and then we'll move from there. And that's not necessarily, but I on the other hand, it kind of feels like he's kind of, saying, well, you can't know everything, and it's so. The reason it seems is that semantic drift from the technical sense of code to the representational sense of code. So this is where this is logically flawed, kind of making this like bait and switch where you say, well, it's all about, encoding something, and then you kind of add a bunch of complexity into the system, maybe based on like what a computer does or what you need to have in place. But that's not where you originally started. You originally started by saying the code is maybe a correspondence between two things, and then now you're saying, well, it's doing all these complex mechanisms, and that's basically, I think, what he's trying to get at there is that it's, you're building kind of like you have this basic mechanism and you find it to be like, maybe adequate, but then you add in a model that's like, okay, this is how it must work because we've established that there's a correspondence. Now there's this higher level representation that must exist, and maybe it doesn't exist. Maybe we're just, kind of building a model without validating it really, and saying, well, since the first one worked, this one had to work too. No, I don't know. I mean, like that may or may not be like a good argument. I'm not really sure. I'm sure if you were like working in neural coding, you probably could refute it. I don't know. Like, I'm not really sure, but yeah, it's right. Yeah.
Do you want to say more about what you wrote here, Amanda?
Yeah, I was trying to make sense of at the end of the quote, where he's saying there's this drift from one sense of coding to another sense. So my understanding is that the technical sense of encoding basically just means that and this is the sense in which neurons do code. Please correct me if I'm wrong there, but neurons do code in the sense that they are a way that the brain gets information about the environment. Not saying anything specific about what information is or how they do it or how much information. And that maybe that seems true. But then what's different is this representational sense of coding, which is that there's a particular neural pattern that is equivalent to a certain concept or phenomenal experience. And I think that before the paragraph that we quoted, when he's talking about how when you're what does he say exactly? The top of page 4, the column on the right, talking about this ideal observer. It's like if the representational sense of encoding is what is happening, then when you remember a number that you've committed to memory, what you're remembering is the particular pattern of neural spikes. But then how does that set of spikes that happened, however long ago, how does that get remembered? That doesn't really make any sense. I think he's saying that doesn't make sense because it's that's a flawed concept of representation, but that's kind of the concept that's implicit in a lot of these discussions about neural coding.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good.
Did you want to say more about Gibsonian variants as well, or is that?
I think that that'd be interesting to bring that. So what were you thinking? And did you put that down, or Amanda?
Yeah, I did. I thought
Okay.
I was getting ahead of myself a little because I thought that came up in this section, but it's a little later. Where he's talking about the Martian iguana. I can't find it exactly, but he's talking about how one plausible hypothesis about what type of information the brain encodes is it's basically Gibsonian invariance. And then in the iguana example, this was kind of a note to myself too, because you hear a Gibsonian invariant. It's about things that do not vary. But in the example he gives, the thing that is invariant is like the law of variation between the two signals hitting the two ears.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I don't have any more to say about that at the moment.
Yeah, so this equation will produce these curves. The curves are different for different contexts, but they're basically produced by the same law. It's kind of like if you had a regression equation, you could have a couple of different equations depending on the parameters, and then that would describe different types of data. The data are different, but you can capture that variation in those different. So you could say like the function that we predict for sensory loss shifts over different contexts, I guess, which is actually the way we usually do things in psychophysics. It's not though that there's this mechanism that's invariant in I guess the mechanism would be maybe like the tuning curve, but you'd have this, you'd have these different things. It's almost like you have when he says like a Martian iguana, yeah, he calls it a Martian iguana in reference to Dennett. So Daniel Dennett actually came up with this. The iguana is fixed on the ground, and there is another organism, let us call it a frog, that produces sounds. The frog is usually still and produces some random sounds repeatedly, and occasionally jumps to a new position. So there's variation in the environment. That is, it's basically the same sound, but it comes maybe from different directions. The question is, to what kind of information can the iguana have access based on the acoustic signal at two ears? So if it's like, if the iguana or if the frog is on top of the iguana's head, that information is different than if the iguana is often in the far distance, or if it's way over on the left versus way over on the right. So then that's of course and then when the source produces a sound, two sound waves, SL and SR, arrive at the two ears, and these two sound waves have a particular property. They are delayed versions of one another. So again, it's coming from the left. It hits the left ear before it hits the right ear. There's a delay in that, and that presupposes no echoes or other types of things going on in the environment, reverberations, whatever. And so then we can write an equation to describe that delay. That's physics of the environment. Now, in a Martian context, let's suppose we weren't on Mars, we were on a planet where the sound waves had to travel through a thicker medium of air. So it could be the atmosphere is much thicker than what we're used to on Earth, say. So that those sound waves would travel slower, they would still be a little bit more, they'd be delayed, but there'd still be that delay between the ears. Now let's say then that environment, that atmosphere was actually had a lot of heterogeneity in it, and it was anisotropic. So you had all sorts of weird vortices in the air that kind of hang there, and the sound bounces around. Maybe there are a bunch of trees in between the frog and the iguana. So the trees, there's sound that's bouncing off those trees, and so that and the trees are like rubbery, so it's like absorbing some of the sound waves. So that really is going to affect perhaps this pickup of information, which Gibson talked about. And so we have this a little bit different scenario. So Gibson talked about an invariant structure in the sensory flow, which is to say that the signals obey a particular law. So it should be law-like as we have with our sensory law. And then, let's see, thus the sensory world of the iguana is made up of random pairs of signals that follow particular laws of the iguana can identify. So this is where Gibson says you're picking up information from the environment. There's the physics in the world, the physical sort of properties of the world that are going to affect what you can pick up as information. So this is not like, okay, so evidently information is not meant in the sense of Shannon, but in the sense of laws or models of the sensory input. So this is not, this is not something that happens in the nervous system per se. This is something that's happening in the environment. There's a physics of the environment. And if you change those physics appreciably, it changes how that information is picked up. It still probably doesn't negate the delay because your head is located in space and there's a distance between the two centers of where the information can be picked up. But if you were to say like have different properties to the environment, radically different properties, it may affect the amount of pickup that you can do. And so this is, I think what he's trying to get at here is that your, so you're not talking about predictive coding in the brain. You're not talking about the coding aspect of the neurons. You're talking about the environment before you get to the neurons. And then that's what's really kind of mediating a lot of this coding. So the code is built in the environment, not in the brain. And it's kind of interesting because, for one, we're doing all this stuff on Gibsonian information. But on the other hand, it really kind of, is a sort of an ecological view of neural coding because the code is in the environment more than in the brain. That's basically what he's arguing here, or it could be. We don't really know. So then he goes through more about predictive coding and all this, which is gonna kind of lead us into this discussion on, is predictive coding something that happens in the brain or somewhere else? So it's it's really interesting.
One thing I'm trying to wrap my head around is, so we're like thinking of kind of alternative or I don't know, generally 4E versions of this of neural coding, but I'm wondering how is any like truly ecological version of neural coding still going to count as neural coding in the way that, at least in the way that this author is presenting it, or will it become too, not like watered down, but will it drift too far from the like original coding metaphor if we make it properly 4E?
I mean, I think they're probably. I mean, he's kind of glossing over what might happen in the brain after you have these these sensory laws in the environment. The environment usually has to have some sort of structure in order to become like a something that you can identify. So if you had a gray goo out there, you wouldn't be able to do much with that because there's nothing there. It's just it's a uniform environment. It's homogeneous, and there's no information to pick up, or there's nothing there. Just picking up information from the environment is, I think, probably a requisite of neural coding. I mean, you have to have the information in the environment to do any kind of coding with it, because otherwise it's just like you're seeing the same thing. It's always the same thing. Now, whatever is going on in the brain, that's, I think he's kind of maybe not really focusing on that for reasons of building the argument. I think that there would probably be a lot of role for internal processing. For one thing, these kind of the Gibsonian pickup sort of serves as like a precondition. So it's like, a prior. But it also, suggests that maybe you don't need a lot of context in the brain. Maybe the context is in the environment, and you maybe have a base code that kind of operates based on what the environment is giving you. I mean, I don't know. But.
Yeah, I guess my thought is like, will that still count as encoding and decoding of a signal from the environment?
Yeah, I don't know. It might not. Yeah, we're really kind of getting into like changing the argument. So it's like and another thing is like when you build a model, you can attach things to different definitions. So you can say, well, there's decoding and encoding, but we just do it differently. And it seems like it's not a big deal, but it kind of is because it's like I guess we can pick up information from the environment that would be encoding because we don't just use that information as like it's raw in its raw form. We also, like in terms of learning and memory, we recall things and we encode things. We have them somewhere. We store them somewhere, right? We were talking about the engram before. We don't know if there's an engram, but we store that information somewhere and then we retrieve it somewhere. So it's not, we can store things in the environment, but that's largely relying on the brain to make that kind of, to pick up, to retrieve the information from a place. So that, there are all these things. I think there's a basic argument for things being stored in the brain, but like how that's structured is pretty much, I think that's what they're really kind of arguing about here. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
I'm gonna put this here. This is really good discussion. There's a lot of things in this paper we're getting at, some really juicy stuff. I'm really glad you all are here because I think it's like the highlight thing. There we go. Whee! Yes, good stuff. Well, it's hard for me to believe like it's only 10 minutes left. So I think we're kind of there's like there's 3 pages, 4. There's much more. Okay.
Yeah,
I thought we were close to the edge of the paper, but we are not. We're not really close to finishing this paper today. At least like the initial paper, not the responses. Which is okay. I think that that was the 3.3 iguana part. So we're kind of up to 3.4 generative models. Do we want to just kind of go through this, or are you any other like summary thoughts we want to talk about? Because I feel like we have a lot. There's a lot that's being said, a lot of really good stuff. I don't want to try to distill anything while moving on, or just keep rolling with the 10 minutes we have.
Yeah, I think we can do maybe one more section and see how far we get with that.
Okay. So here we are. Predictive coding theory and its derivatives, Clark, Friston, Round, Ballard, propose that the brain encodes internal model which predicts sensory inputs. More precisely, neurons are thought to encode variables of hierarchical model of the inputs, which higher order neurons encode the prediction of the activity and lower in the hierarchy down sensory inputs. This prediction is subtracted from the lower order neurons only, so only the prediction error remains. Compressed representation of the inputs is an efficient coding type of efficient coding theory. Generative model, because it maps internal variables to observables, in contrast to the models of physics, which take the form of relations between observables. Generative models are not the kind of internal models described in the previous section. Iguana. successfully represent the world in perception depends crucially on the canceling of the prediction error from Clark. I don't know if you want to say anything about the iguana and his head moving here. And comparing this to the genera model. The appeal of predictive processing is that making predictions seems to be a prerequisite to goal-directed behavior and thus fundamental aspect of behavior. Authors have argued anticipation is not simply a property of the nervous system, but every fundamental property of life. See Machuana and Varela, those guys.
Well,
and then, yes.
I just said whoa to
Oh.
Varela. I want to see what that reference is.
I think that's the book, or that's their book on autopoiesis, or one of their papers
Okay.
on autopoiesis.
It's
'Cause,
like in my opinion.
yeah, they also cite Rosen 1985, which is anticipatory systems and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, that basically is arguing that anticipation is so. You need to have some mechanism for like goal directedness. So it could be like, for example, some code that you interpret, or it could be some sort of anticipatory thing, like if you need water, or if you can predict things about the world, or something like that. That's basically what they're arguing. Now we talked about predictive coding in the Saturday meeting once, so that was where we had talked about kind of predictive coding and how it's one of many models, and people criticize predictive coding for presuming that there's a predictive mechanism where maybe we just have feedback. So if we have positive feedback, that's not really prediction necessarily. Some people go as far as to say we have like Bayesian priors, or memories are Bayesian priors. And it's very intuitive, but then the question is that a good model of the brain? Are we really doing that? And so that's kind of the point here too, is that maybe predictive processing relies on neural coding, and if the edifice of neural coding is flawed, then maybe that's flawed as well. So I mean, I don't know, like, I think it's worth bringing up, and then there are these other approaches kind of related to it from complex systems. So the thing after the Maturana and Varela and Rosen citations, that passage. For example, our Martian iguana can predict how some properties of its sensory inputs should change if it were to turn its head. So the iguana can turn its head. It has this neural code of like turning its head, and then it needs to predict what would happen, what needs to change in the sensory inputs, or what will change in the sensory inputs. Because the iguana might be tracking the sound of a frog and it moves its head, that intertemporal difference changes. Remember, it's hitting one ear and then the other ear. But if the frog is in the direction that the iguana suddenly looks towards, then that intertemporal distance changes because the orientation to the stimulus changes. So this is the thing that we have to think about. We can think about neural coding as a very simple positive feedback model or something like that, but then you have this changing behavior. It's the naturalistic behavior we were talking about earlier. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. You might change the orientation of your head, and then where are you? Can you keep track of the frog? Well, it turns out that if you're like tracking a sound, you don't lose track of it. So it's going up. So there's this, consider the other example in human behavior. When someone is facing a cliff, she tends to lean slightly backwards because this posture makes it easier to move backwards if necessary. It's just anticipation there. But this is not all. The technical sense of prediction and predictive coding is argued by Anderson and Shimero. And so there's your Shimero. And they're making a point of prediction here. A neuron predicts the sensory inputs in the sense that its firing correlates with them. So a neuron's firing correlates with the sensory inputs. More specifically, a spike produced by a neuron leads to the subtraction of the expected input by a target neuron, which is the input occurring now or possibly if we incorporate conduction delays, what will be happening after a fixed delay. So this is not the kind of prediction implied by an anticipatory postural adjustment. So this is just kind of matching in the code. It's not really anticipating anything. It's just making space. It's a correlation, which is a weak relationship. It's not causal necessarily. And it's making space for the other thing, but it's not really anticipating anything. It's not like you have a pre-prepared thing where it's not like, it's not like, or it doesn't already incorporate the information. It's kind of responding to it. So that's an important point. If I change my posture this way, then it will be easier to move backwards in the hypothetical event my balance is challenged. I mean, that's very much post hoc rationalization. It's like you see something and you say, "Oh yeah, that's what's happening," but the brain doesn't afford that luxury. It has to be like, predictive. It has to say, "This is what's going to happen before it happens." That's his point. So it's like either you can make like a post hoc rationalization, or it's truly predictive, but it's not both.
I'm not saying this very well, but yeah. Yes, there's a lot there. I think it'd be good to kind of continue from this next time, because I think there's a lot to kind of say. It might be, bonus points home if everybody wants to look into these things and kind of talk about them more next time. We can kind of know them, but like we've got a lot of names that are core to things we've been looking at in this group, or even like proto underlying to them even in this paragraph. So maybe we should think about it more. But we're kind of approaching the top of the hour. Any other thoughts? I thought Amanda kind of writing something maybe, or are there other thoughts about where we are before we kind of almost get to this section?
Just one thing I wanted to say is that I checked Pribram's Languages of the Brain book, and the subtitle is Experimental Paradoxes and the Structure of anyway, it's his work, and is definitely going to get into the 3.5 and representing structure, and I think that's just interesting because again, like this is Languages of the Brain was 1981, and of course the their problems of the binding problem is something that he was obviously worried about, but this sorry, again, jumping ahead to this superposition catastrophe, and how do you bring all this together? So it's great when we're talking about these codes in isolation, but I think there's going to be some really interesting connections to his work as you go on to 3.5 here. And
I'm downloading
I'll
some
try and
PDFs right now.
Yeah.
okay. I might ask you for those. By the way, I am in contact with his partner, who can, has control over all his published works, and she's really interested in someone going through that and making better use, and like we shouldn't have to download them off of. Yeah. Anyway.
Off places,
and,
yes.
Yeah. She's the author, Catherine Neville. I don't know if you've read any of her books, but she's done some cool.
I'm sure that's name.
She's done some. She would hate this characterization. She'd be like, "I was writing before Dan Brown," but anyway, she's got some very Dan Brown like books. So we would talk. She loved it because I was there for brain science, but I could talk about strange secret societies and mystical religious philosophy as well. So she's really fun.
What's her name?
Catherine Neville, and like she has like a really interesting backstory too.
Do you know how to spell her last name? I'm sure we'll find it.
Neville, I believe. So I think calculated risk is a big. She was the first female, the first woman like working as vice president of Bank of America. So I think her banking book is called Calculated Risk. But then she got into much more
Banking, sci-fi, neuron stuff.
yeah. Well, she she definitely got more into 8th century religious traditions and mystical connections and things like that. Total asides, but again, like I started in philosophy and my thesis was on William Blake. So
oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. And not only that, but the Song of Jerusalem, which I don't know if anybody, most people don't even know about the Song of Jerusalem. But that was his longest work too.
Excellent. Any other thoughts about this before we go? We're going over the edge, careening off the edge in a great way, in a great spectacular way. Okay, this was great. I hope everybody can come again next week, same time, same place.
Yeah.
Be there. But thank you. And you want to write notes here, you can. If you want to share PDFs, that'd be great. But I'll see you next time. Thanks everybody very much. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
See ya.
See ya.